Greetings, friends. I Vitaly Portnikov. The publication of The Politician claims that the White House continues to consider options that relate to the annexation of Greenland to the United States. Of the possibility of such accession, Donald Trump said during his first tenure as President of the United States. Returning to the Oval Office, he remembered Greenland literally in the first days after the start of his second presidency. And finally, now, in the new political situation that has matured after the capture of Venezuelan dictator Nicolas Maduro by the American Special Services in Caracas, the topic of Greenland has arisen again. And Trump again says that the United States should have this territory, which is an autonomous part of the kingdom. Washington claims that military force will not be used to control Greenland. However, the administration of the President of the United States is spreading the possibility of promoting a referendum on the declaration of Greenland's independence, especially since there are significant forces on the island advocating such independence. It is claimed that Washington is considering the Russian experience of influencing political processes in former Soviet republics, where Moscow tried to achieve a positive result with the help of a real impact on political processes and a broad agreement with some of the elites. However, it should be remembered that in Russia, when it came to democratic processes, it was never possible to achieve any impressive results in countries such as Ukraine, Moldova, and even Georgia. And only dictate and hard power remained real tools. Moscow to influence those former Soviet republics in which a real democratic process is taking place. In addition, there is another problem for this approach to the situation. As is known, the Trump administration sees another vote as a further step after the declaration of Greenland's independence, which is designed to make Greenland a U.S. state. But then, just the vast majority of the population, 85% of Greenlanders opposed to Greenland became part of the United States. The United States. And it is not at all obvious that Donald Trump and his entourage have any real tools to change public opinion on the island. After all, Greenlanders can closely follow the fate of Alaska natives who have practically been assimilated and lost their identity after Alaska became part of the United States. And so far, there has been no reason to believe that the Trump administration has any understanding of the importance of Greenlandic identity. One of the solutions. Donald Trump, after he returned to the post of President of the United States, was renaming one of the key peaks of Alaska to the peak of former American President McKinley and abandoning the name the mountain that was bound with the legacy of the indigenous population of Alaska. This is hardly an example that will convince the people of Greenland that the Trump administration will respect their identity. But then there is another way that Washington is thinking about. This is the Greenland exchange. Ukraine. In other words, European countries, including Denmark itself, agree with the transfer of control over Greenland. And the United States, in turn, guarantees such opportunities for Ukraine, which they will make it impossible for the Russian Federation to attack this country. But the very idea of exchanging control over Greenland for security guarantees for Ukraine looks theoretical, if only because today the President of the United States has no results way to force the President of the Russian Federation Vladimir Putin to end the Russian-Ukrainian war. American and European leaders argue that any security guarantees can come into force only if it is possible to achieve a real peace agreement and a ceasefire in Ukraine. To Ukraine, however, the Kremlin's tactics today are to delay peace talks and to use this diplomacy to continue the war against Ukraine and, ultimately, to destroy the neighboring state, which remains an important political goal of Russian President Vladimir Putin. And it is not clear whether Donald Trump can really influence the position of the Russian president, and what security guarantees he can provide to Ukraine so that European countries are sure that Putin, even in the case of a theoretical achievement, ceasefire agreements on Ukrainian soil in the coming months or years, it will not try to redeploy aggression against a neighboring country when Russia has enough new military potential to resume hostilities. Or, for example, when Donald Trump leaves the Oval Office, which will happen in a few years. So the Ukrainian topic is also quite controversial when we talk about the situation related to Trump's attempts to gain control over Greenland and find any opportunity for deal with the Europeans. And then there remains the last, rather dangerous factor, the conquest of Greenland. It is clear that this will not be a serious problem for the United States. A small number of Greenland's population, the presence of an American military base on the island, and the obvious unwillingness of European countries to fight with the United States can turn the establishment of control over Greenland into an easy walk for the American military. But at the same time, this decision may have the consequences of a real political earthquake. Prime Minister of Denmark Mette Frederiksen absolutely reasonably declares that it will mean the end of NATO. And indeed, a country that is called upon to protect Denmark from external threats will itself become an aggressor against its ally. It will be something similar, but much more so than what happened in Crimea in 2014, Russia, the guarantor of Ukraine's security under the Budapest Memorandum, itself violated the sovereignty of Ukraine and annexed part of the territory of a neighboring country to itself, without complying with any international norms, rights, nor with the norms of their own domestic legislation. If the United States takes such a step, it will, of course, split both the ranks of the alliance and the Europeans themselves, because there is no doubt that some part of the European leaders will support Donald Trump in his expansionist actions, while the majority, some Europeans, are in solidarity with Denmark, realizing that agreeing with such actions of the American president will lead to the creation of two imperialist pressure centers on the European continent in Washington and Moscow, and does not exclude joining the efforts of Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin to eliminate the existing world order and replace it with an imperialist dictate with the possible use of weapons of any type. However, so far, in order to say that the White House has come to the idea of conquest Greenland, we still need to see how events will develop, and whether Donald Trump will not forget about the importance of establishing full control over Greenland in the next month. In the end, so far we can say that the United States can try others options for influencing the situation. To try to speed up the process of holding a referendum on the independence of the island in Greenland. To try to achieve the annexation of Greenland to the United States by political means. Or to look for formulas for exchanging control over Greenland on guarantees for the security of Ukraine. If this happens for a long enough time, then we can assume that during this time, the presidency of Donald Trump will end, and you and I will see a new American president who will be more cautious about what is happening with Greenland, and to what forms the American presence on the island can be strengthened. The only thing that really needs to be said is that the presence and strengthening of the military presence of the United States in the Arctic really meets the national interests America, and the national interests of Denmark, and the national interests of the Greenlanders themselves. Only it is absolutely not necessary that this presence should be carried out in the form of pressure, military conquest, or even the forcible annexation of Greenland to the United States. Thank you, friends. Stay on this channel. Subscribe to him, subscribe to my social network channels in Patroni Bimi Coffee and Donatella, who helps to develop the resources. Use the function of the sponsorship in the YouTube. Peace.